My very special guest today for this quarantine edition is political advisor Jim Messina. He was the Deputy Chief of Staff for President Obama, and he's now the CEO of the Messina Group. He's also advised a number of international campaigns, and I have been looking forward to this interview for over a week now since I found out we'd be talking to him. It's a pleasure to welcome Jim Messina back to the program. How are you doing?
Great, Evan. How are you?
I'm doing well, but tell me how you're holding up during these difficult times.
Well, I am at our ranch in Montana, which is a pretty great place. If you got a shelter in place, do it on a ranch in Montana. But, it is difficult watching the whole world struggle with this and look at the economic and political ramifications of it.
We're all in a kind of unique position right now. We're all watching from home what's happening around the world and here in the country. And I'm also sure that you have sources you're talking to. So tell me what it's like watching this all go down, and how are you dealing with all of this?
Well, I think a couple things. What you realize in moments of crisis. So when I was White House Deputy Chief of Staff, we went through the great economic crisis of 08 and 09. We had, the oil spill. We had a whole bunch of things. And what you realize in moments of crisis is a couple things happen. One, it's a true test of leadership. And for our presidents and prime minister clients around the world, no one can plan for this. You can do tabletops and you can kind of, do worst case scenarios, but until you're really confronted with this, you don't really know how it's going through. And this is really a once in a generation crisis because it's both health and economic as well as political. And so you're seeing all three of those different systems who don't always work together, politics, health, and economics, have to deal with each other. And you're seeing, true crisis in all three. And that is, just as a world person watching it all, a terrible thing to watch. It's also difficult watching that, some of the terrible, deaths and tragedies and people losing their lives and businesses and livelihoods. You realize how this is an event that hopefully only happens once every 100 years.
So let's talk about that, because a lot of comparisons are being made to this, versus something else that happened in history. What do you think is the most appropriate comparison?
You can't be in politics and not study history. And I have this theory that history always repeats itself. I think the great pandemics of the early 1900s are the most corollary example. And you're sort of seeing exactly what happened then happen, which is, people didn't think it was going to be as serious as it was. Then we kind of got to a point where people are like, okay, I'm now over it. I want to go back to my normal life. They tried to do that. And then, history teaches us as the pandemic came back even tougher the second time. I fear that's what could happen. But it is interesting. I've also spent a bunch of time reading about black swan events in economics and politics, because, everything we thought we understood about politics and the economy and health 6 months ago is now completely changed on its head. The only reason why this one is different is just technology, right? We've never had the instant access to technology, both to discuss it and understand it. And that's some of the theories about why the curve is bent so quickly. And hopefully it'll allow us to recover faster than previous pandemic or economic crises.
You've been called the most powerful person in Washington that you've never heard of. That's quite a nickname. Why do you think that is?
Well, when I worked in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate, and then as the president's chief of staff, I tried to stay out of the limelight. I didn't like, I didn't go on TV. I didn't do interviews. I just truly wanted to use the system to get things done. And, traditionally, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, for your viewers and listeners who like the West Wing, that's a job Josh Lyman had. It's a job Karl Rove had, and I had it. And it was always known as a pretty powerful position because of where you were in the government. And hopefully I used it for good and not bad.
So it's funny you mentioned the West Wing, because I just started watching it again for whatever reason. And so you've obviously seen the show. What what resembles any reality from your time when you worked there?
Well, I think the writing is stunning, right? And I think the discussions and the fire discussions you have, the thing you realize, I worked in Capitol Hill for 20 years, over 20 years, before I got to the White House. And the thing that you don't realize is by the time an issue gets to the White House, it is so broken, no other agency can fix it. And so every day you're having these things get dumped on your desk that are just huge problems. In early 2009, I'll give you one example. This was like 7, 8 years after 9/11, and I was at lunch, and all of a sudden someone came running into the restaurant saying, "The president wants you back in the White House right now." So I ran across the street and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, some idiot just flew Air Force One, the plane, past the Statue of Liberty on a photo shoot and scared the entire downtown New York. And people had heart attacks. And, I want to figure out what the heck happened and you deal with it." And then, I had to launch a whole investigation, and the person who authorized it was fired in like the next 24 hours. And we had the White House issue an apology. That was just kind of one day and one little look at what happens every day in the White House. So that's kind of what I think the West Wing got right. What they got wrong is I certainly wasn't as good looking as the actors. I cussed way more than they ever did, and I was not as healthy.
Well, it certainly paints a very romanticized version of or idealized version of what a White House could look like. So do you think it painted too rosy a picture for the reality of the situation?
Yeah, it's not always state dinners and all the fun stuff they do. I think it's usually, bone crushing 18-hour days, 7 days a week. But, um, President Bush on his last day as president and the day before we took office, he said to me, he's like, "Jim, when you start coming to work here tomorrow, remember that, you're part of a 200-year tradition, and you're not a Democrat, you're not a Republican, you're an American, and your job is just to do the best you can for the country." And I think that everyone who serves in those positions hopefully knows that. And I will forever be incredibly proud of the president's campaign manager. But it was certainly the hardest thing I will ever do, and something that I likely wouldn't do again.
Well, if you were asked to go to the White House today and run communications for the situation we're going through right now, how would you run communications for the American response?
I'd kind of take everything President Trump is doing and do the opposite. I would first of all try to base everything in science. I would attempt to bring the country together, like President Bush did after 9/11, like Bill Clinton did after the Oklahoma City bombings. I would try to bring and make people understand why we're all in this together, why social distancing is so important, why listening to the healthcare experts matters most. And I would attempt to be every single thing I said as the White House, as the president, as staff, be incredibly carefully worded and just be honest when you make mistakes. Because in the White House, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to try to react too quickly. And I think part of what people by the end of the 8 years really appreciated about President Obama was his you watched him think through these things, and he was really honest about the pluses and minuses. And I think as you go through crises, that is the most important thing. For my president and prime minister clients around the world, we talk about their response to the COVID thing. What I keep saying to them is you just want to be as fulsome as you can about what you know as soon as you know it, good and bad. And you want to, make sure that, you put people's lives first, understand that, it's not just about health, it's about the economy, it's about everything else. And you have to be a president who thinks about all of those things. And so if I was in the White House now, that's what I would try to do.
This week we learned that your former boss will be giving the commencement address in a virtual ceremony that's going to be televised around the country, around the world. Why do you think that students called for him to be part of this, and what do you think his message will be?
Well, apparently there was a huge change.org petition to get him to do it. And it's not something that's kind of unprecedented. I think it's the best idea I've heard in a very long time. And I know Michelle Obama is going to have her own set of things she's doing as well. Because as I like to tease her husband, she's the most popular political figure in the world, not him. But what he's going to do is twofold. First, he's going to remind everyone we're all in this together, and that out of adversity, and let's be honest, missing your part of your senior year and not getting to graduate is adversity. There can come great things from that. And the second thing I think he'll do is just remind people that we're all in this together and that we all have to take actions in our lives in politics, in life, in business, in whatever, to make this place, this world better. And as you graduate and as you kind of think about the next steps in your life, these are, kind of rare moments. When you get my age, you realize that there's rare moments when you can kind of reinvent yourself and think about what you want to do and say, what are my priorities? What do I really want to be? What are the things that I most value? And I think that President Obama is going to speak to those decisions because he definitely went through it when he was young, as he's documented in his books. And it's time for everyone to kind of find the answers to those questions.
So, did you see that Michelle Obama's documentary went on Netflix recently?
I
Have you
did.
seen it yet?
I have not. That stuff is still too personal to me. I just can't. I'm saving all that stuff for a time when I'm less close to it.
Gotcha. One of my favorite anecdotes that you've shared with me last time we spoke was what the former president, did for you while you were dating your wife. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, so I was wooing her, and I was living in DC. She was living in California, and so our weekends were pretty important. She was coming out to DC to spend time with me, and he wanted me to go with him to Milwaukee, Wisconsin on Labor Day to do a rally with union members. And one of his staffers said, "Hey, Jim's girlfriend's coming to town, someone else to be with you." And he said, "No, no, just invite her." And so she got to go on Air Force One. He came and there was a bunch of elected officials and all the other people, and he gave her his own tour and of the Air Force One while we were flying. And then he walked her to the door and made sure she got, into the car safely. And he looked at me and said, "Messina, is there anything else I can do to help you?" I laughed. It is still something. I still have a picture on my desk of the president and Taya and I on Air Force One from that day. It was a long time ago, 9 years ago, but it will be something. Those moments, I work for lots of politicians. I think I can count on one finger the number of politicians who would have cared that much about a staffer's uh, personal life and family. And that's just kind of a reflection of the leader he was and is, and the kind of guy that I was really proud to serve.
Well, they may not be as good as that story, but can you tell us any other behind the scenes moments from big moments in your life in that world?
Yeah, I remember a couple of big things. The very first day of the White House, the day he took office, we had this big fight in the Oval Office about what issues to do, right? We were in the middle of the economic crisis. We just passed the stimulus bill at the end of the Bush world. We were going to pass another one that week. We had to figure out, do you do education reform? Do you do energy reform? Do you do health care? Do you do an infrastructure bill? And we had a really robust debate about it. And finally, the president stood up and said, "Look, I got to go to the inaugural balls tonight and dance with my wife at 10 balls. Um, but I want to tell you, I've heard all of your guys' views. And most of you are saying don't do healthcare because 10 presidents in a row have tried to fix the healthcare system and everyone has failed. And, it kind of ruined Bill Clinton's first term. George Bush had attempted to reform Social Security and Medicare, and it kind of, you know, killed his popularity. The second term didn't really get anything done. He's like, I know you're all worried about it, but when you campaign for president, you realize as you go around the world how broken this whole thing is. And the only thing that really matters is doing big things. And then he looked around the room and he's like, might I remind most of you in this room that all of you told me not to run for president because I couldn't win. And when you get to do something that no one thought you could do, you realize that it's only important to do the right thing. So we're doing healthcare, and it's going to start tomorrow. And he looked at me and he said, Messina, how long to get it through the Senate? And I said, no more than 6 months. 14 months later, I went to the basketball court at the White House where he was shooting hoops, waiting for the votes to come in on the House passage. And I said, congratulations, Mr. President. After 100 years of trying, we have the votes to pass universal health care in America. And he leaned, there's still a photo of this. He leaned over and hugged me and whispered in my ear, I told you so. And it was those kind of moments that you get to do when you worked at the White House.
So that was probably your biggest accomplishment, getting that passed. Is that right?
That and Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then the reelection campaign were the three things that I will forever be proud of.
What would you say wasn't perfect about the ACA?
Oh, I think, look, what you learn from history again is that you can't do big system reforms. Remember, healthcare is 19% of the economy without needing to go back and fix some things later. It's true with Social Security, it's true with Medicare, et cetera. And so, I think that one of the things I wish was in the bill was some sort of competition, government competition, a public option, some sort of thing to drive down costs. I wish that would have been in the bill, and it wasn't, because we didn't have the votes to put it in the bill. I think that's one thing that I wish people in DC would stop playing politics with Obamacare and actually just go fix a couple things in it, which everyone agrees should be fixed. But regardless, over 100 million Americans who had pre-existing conditions because of things like cancer and other things, like my wife, can now get health insurance and not have it taken care of. You and your generation can stay on your parents' plans. You can get a bunch of free services like yearly physicals and a bunch of other things that just weren't in there, weren't allowed to have, Americans didn't have before that passed. And it will forever change the world.
A few years ago when we talked, President Trump's plan to repeal and replace it was the talk of the town. And since then we've seen some of those efforts take place. But in this unprecedented time, is there an argument to be made for guaranteeing health care as a right for all Americans, especially in this pandemic?
I mean, that's certainly the advocates of some sort of a national health care, Medicare for all, version would point out that, this shows the stress on the system. I advise one of the largest hospital chains in New York. And, I'm on my daily calls there, they're building intensive care units in the parking lot. They are 80% Medicaid and Medicare funding, which means that they're mostly people who can't afford to have health care on their own. And they can't afford to pay for any of the services that they're getting from this hospital. How you deal with these things, what you realize when you go through these crises is on the back end. Hopefully there'll be a national conversation about what are the goods, what are the bads, what do we need to do in the future to make sure that something like this, A, hopefully doesn't happen again, although we know it will. But B, now that we've gone through this, what are the lessons? I think there are opportunities, right? There are opportunities to use technology in different ways. The governor of my home state is also my former post-college roommate. And he and I were talking the other day, he's like, you know what, we figured out, you can do a lot of this stuff online. Like, why do people go to DMVs anymore? You can do that online. I've spent hours of my life at the DMV trying to get license plates. That doesn't make any sense. We can do it online. We can do a lot of this stuff online. Before this whole thing, 10 million people a month did online digital calls like you and I are doing right now. Now it's 300 million a month. I usually travel 300,000 miles a year. I don't travel at all right now, and it's okay. I'm doing all the things. So this is going to change the way we live and work. The challenge is just how can we do it in a way that makes our lives better and more productive. And I hope healthcare is going to lead that, because as we look at trying to find a vaccine for this, trying to get the approval process sped up, we can't wait 18 months, which is with the current estimates. We got to find a way to get this done quicker. And I really do believe that government, technology, and healthcare are all going to combine to figure this out together.
So let's turn to the 2020 election now. The economic repercussions are going to play a factor for sure. And for what's left of the campaign, I'm just wondering how the pandemic will affect it. Could you see calls for a national mail-in ballot or just people avoiding the polling places altogether?
Yeah, it is a really great question. I think the pandemic's going to have a few big effects. First of all, we don't really know what's going to happen in the fall. What the scientists tell us is the numbers are likely going to come back in the fall, depending on whether people go back to school and the workplace, et cetera. And to your point, that could make it very difficult to vote. And so some states are being proactive, very proactive in allowing vote by mail. That is a decision that the governors have to make, not the feds. So each governor has to figure that out and what they're doing. There's lawsuits in every single battleground state in the presidential contesting these issues. Both sides have different views about vote by mail that are largely influenced by politics and not science or not data. Um, but I think you'll see more of those things. Some of it, we don't even know what the rules are going to be, right? Because um, in the, for instance, a lot of these primaries in the spring have been moved back to the summer and the fall. So we don't even know who Georgia, for example, the Georgia US Senate candidates are going to be on both the Democratic and Republican side until September for a November election. We don't know how these court cases are going to rule, so we don't know when vote by mail starts or if it starts. This is what we call a super year, Evan, meaning it's one every 10 years the census starts, right? And as you all know, you've got your census forms in the mail. And so whoever wins and has control of the state legislatures in January gets to make the lines for districts for the next decade. And so there's lawsuits about all that stuff. So the pandemic puts just huge uncertainty. The other thing is just from a campaign perspective, you don't know how to campaign. Traditionally, both parties, President Trump's best skill besides social media is his big rallies, his MAGA rallies he does. It's very unclear whether he'll ever be able to do another MAGA rally during the entire campaign. Democrats tend to run campaigns where we knock on doors and knock on dorm rooms and have music festivals and rallies to get people excited. Are we going to be able to do any of that? Or are we just going to hire people to do social media? So you don't know the rules, you don't know how you're going to campaign. And then three, the economy throws just a huge uncertainty into this. What is clear to everyone is we are in a recession we didn't see coming. And of the last 7 presidents to run for reelection in a recession, 6 of them were defeated. Only one in 1924 was able to get reelected. And so you just have complete chaos 186 days before the election.
What do you think Joe Biden is doing well?
Um, I think Joe Biden is getting his own internal campaign together. He just changed campaign managers and put in my former deputy as his new campaign manager. I think it was very smart. I also think he's doing a lot of podcasts like this and other kind of digital things to get ready. And then fortunately, he's being aided by President Trump's daily press conferences where he says crazy things. So all 3 of those things are helpful.
What do you think he's doing wrong?
Um, I don't think he's doing anything wrong. I think the challenge is there, no one has figured out how to campaign in this COVID world, and neither campaign. I think he needs to do more digital things. And I think they're kind of addressing that. Um, but I think everyone's trying to figure this out. A friend of mine's running this, I think it's $120 million campaign to get huge field operations in the battleground states of young people working in campaigns. And that was supposed to be door knocking, and now you can't knock on anyone's doors. So now they're trying to figure out what the new thing is. Is it digital? Is it Facebook? Is it Snapchat? What is that? That's what Trump's campaign is trying to figure out. That's what Biden's campaign is trying to figure out. Um, you know, I think the one thing that both parties should do is just cancel the conventions because they're relics of another era, and just start the general election now. But no one seems to want to listen to me on that, Evan.
Well, I want to listen to you, and as I mentioned in your introduction, you're the CEO of the Messina Group. What projects are you currently working on?
We are helping a lot of companies try to figure out what to do in this world of pandemic and how they, change, how they use digital and social media and data to talk to their target audiences. If it's a company, to sell a product; if it's a nonprofit, to get people involved; or if it's a campaign, to get them to vote. So we're spending a lot of time trying to build a set of digital and message frameworks. As you know, Evan, I San Francisco and advise a bunch of the tech companies, and some of our companies, I'll pick on one of them, Airbnb. What do you do when suddenly no one can travel and you have all of these challenges, and how do you come out of this, and what are the new rules, and how do you talk to people about what to do in someone's home, and all those things. I spend a lot of time on Zoom calls trying to help people think through what the future is going to be.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. I hope you and your family stay safe during this time, and thank you for joining us from your ranch, Jim. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all you who tuned in today. Stay safe and healthy. Until next time, I'm Evan Sanford, and this is Inside the Studio.